The issue is that most companies for people decisions are essentially, when it boils down to it, most of those decisions are just this executive thinks this is the right decision because they feel like it's the right decision. That's it. And then your only way to convince people that's a good decision is to tell a better story than them. That's it, right? And I think that is a fundamentally limiting factor on how effective we can be as people managers within organizations.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. Rebel HR listeners, thanks for joining us this week. Really excited for the conversation. We have a special guest. Ben Waber, Ph.D., is the president and co-founder of Humanyze. He's a visiting scientist at the MIT Media Lab, previously worked as a senior researcher at Harvard Business School, and received his Ph.D. from MIT for his work with Alex Sandy Pentland's Human Dynamics Group. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really excited for the conversation, and your background is going to be really interesting to dig into. I'd like to start by understanding a little bit about the organization that you co-founded, Humanyze.
Yeah, and Humanyze really spun off the PhD research that my co-founders and I were doing back at MIT. Really motivated by this idea. I guess I had always assumed that when particularly big companies made big people decisions, do a reorg, build a new headquarters. Well, of course, they must collect a lot of data and run tests, and then based on those tests, make people decisions. It was very quickly disabused of that notion. Right?
I'm laughing.
Exactly. And so, again, but it comes down to this basic fact that you could ask pretty much any company in the world really simple questions about what goes on internally, about how work happens, and they just can't answer it. How much does management talk to the engineering team? Nobody knows, right? I mean, even how many hours people work. Mm-hmm. And you think about how simple those questions are, but also how critical they are. And the reason that people can't answer them is they don't have data. Again, we might use surveys, we might use human observation. I mean, of course, that's very useful, but I think we understand the limitations of that, right? I mean, if it's a sunny day out like it is here today in Boston, then you'll answer differently than if it's cloudy at a basic level. But of course, beyond that, we just, as a course of our normal work today, generate so much information about how we're collaborating, about how we're working. We have email, chat, meeting data, even sensor data about the real world. And essentially the metadata from those different systems tell you, well, how are different teams collaborating with each other? How does that change over time? How do people spend time? Really, our focus had been at MIT, and actually continues to be at Humanyze, not so much on the individual level, right? We're really looking at sort of team and higher level metrics. But the idea is that at very large scales, these network effects, how siloed is the organization? For the most successful managers, what do they do differently than other managers? That's actually not about individual level questions. It's about these networks, distributions within the organization. And so at MIT, we were doing studies in a lot of real companies and then figuring out which metrics matter for predicting outcomes we all care about, performance, retention, what have you. After we started the company, then we've been able to do that at larger and larger scales. And essentially what we do is we hook into this existing data, again, that companies already have, and then provide analytics on the health of the organization to these companies. And it actually was pretty exciting. In late 2019, we got to this point where, because we're deployed across every single employee at a number of Fortune 100 companies globally, we actually have for information workers a globally representative data set on how work happens, which is very exciting. And we could talk more about how we got to the point of validating that. But then, of course, it gets to this thing in March 2020 where these metrics move more in a month than you expect to do in a 10-year period. And when I talk about these metrics, it's things like how long are work days, but also how many week ties do people have? And we could talk about how we define that. But so it's a whole variety of metrics where I actually know what that distribution looks like globally, which is very, very interesting. It enables you to do some other much more powerful things as we get more and more data. So, really what companies, use our technology for. Again, obviously today, a lot of it is workplace strategy, frankly. It's which teams, based on how they collaborate, should come into the office, how often, but also with which other teams, who are they collaborating with? What do they need? But really to get a handle on what's going on internally, what's driving the actual KPIs we care about from a people side, right? And then also, as we make management decisions, what is the impact of them? And not waiting 5 years to figure out if this reorg work, but being able to validate very, very quickly, or even test ideally very rapidly, different changes to, again, the way we work.
Fascinating. Yeah, you asked those questions, and I kind of laughed initially because, a lot of times, especially big organizations, you assume that somebody has this all figured out, right? They've some super smart person sat in a room and crunched the data and just figured out, okay, this is the right path forward as to how we structure work, and then like you said, 2020 happened, and I actually think that was a great example of proof that nobody knew what the hell was going on in their workplaces, and were surprised when they figured out, oh, we actually can do some of this virtually, and I guess we didn't actually need all of this office space in order to effectively do our jobs because there was a fundamental misunderstanding about how people actually performed work.
I mean, also, I think on the change management side, all of us would have assumed that we would need a 6-month change management process to effectively move to something like remote work. And basically, given a good reason and 2 weeks of time, people were able to do it pretty effectively. Right now, it's not to say there aren't issues with remote work, and we could talk about that, date on challenges. But in terms of, are people working and are they doing, the best they can? Is it pretty good? The answer is yes, definitively. Right.
Yeah.
And I do think the pandemic has sort of exposed this dirty secret, not just within HR, but I would say management in general, that I think a lot of folks had this assumption, again, that because people are executives at a large company, they must know what they're doing, right? And no one knows what they're doing, right? It's very an example that I like to use to think about this. I fundamentally believe that some of the challenges we see in people management in particular, a lot of it boils down to this fact that there just people aren't data-driven and don't have good reference points for what are actually effective management processes. And so what I think this leads to is a lot of people just copying what some successful company does because they assume that Google's people decisions or Netflix people decisions, well, that must be why they're successful. Of course, they could have been successful in spite of that, right? And a way to think about this for people who are sports fans, I'd encourage you to look at the graph of 3-point shots in the NBA per game. Okay. It's really interesting because think about basketball, pro basketball. That is a workplace. Now, of course, it's very different than where probably most of us work, but it is a workplace with a key difference that we have very easy to understand metrics about success in that environment, right? We have points and we have wins and losses. And we also have the advantage that each team plays, at least 72 games a year. So you're sort of beaten over the head with what essentially are effective, quote unquote, management practices. Now, of course, again, we're talking about basketball, but still think of it as a workplace. And it's interesting because the NBA, if you're familiar with it, back in the late 70s, they introduced the 3-point line. Mm-hmm. So again, before then, every shot was worth 2 points. And you can write down a math equation showing that if you take more 3-point shots, you will score more points and win more games, just straight up. Again, that's subject to certain assumptions about accuracy, but you just leave it at that. Okay. You could maybe make the argument that maybe it would take pro basketball players a couple of years to get used to taking longer shots. And so what you would expect is if you looked at a graph of how many 3-point shots do teams take per game, you maybe expect, an initial uptick. And then after a couple of years, you would assume it would plateau, which would be at like an optimal level. And maybe even if you could use a different argument, you could say, no, it's a generational thing. People need, the new players need their entire careers to be that. Fine. So you wait 20 some years and you'd expect to see this. That's not what you see when you look at that metric. What you see is a slow, steady increase in the number of 3-point shots per game. To today, it's still going up today. And so think about this environment. If this work environment were optimal, people were rational about their workplace decisions, then that shouldn't happen. Right? What's fascinating about basketball, again, is there are objective, easy to understand metrics, right? There are literally every night you are beaten over the head with the fact that taking more 3-point shots is better. It's better. It's objectively better. I can write an equation down and do that. And yet it's still taken them 40 years to get to the point they are today. But now we think about other organizations, think about other types of work where you don't have that kind of objective metric, right? If you're building software products, for example, right? How should you work today? How does that impact the actual sales of that software product? It's actually unclear, right? Now you can, again, over time show correlations, but it takes a lot more time to show that effect. So there's, and also the rules aren't as static. The rules of society, of what the market demands, changes all the time. And so, and beyond that, we don't have 72 games a year, right? Maybe if you have over your entire career, maybe you have a couple dozen large projects that you do over your entire career, not every single year. And so I think all these effects compound just the misunderstandings that people have about people management in particular. And this is why sort of a lot of folks just resort to copying rather than what I would argue, like looking at data, reading, academic meta-analyses. I think that's the right way to go. But I think that this is like a really big issue for HR. And I think the pandemic has exposed this because so many decisions that companies are making are, falling flat on their face and just exposing to employees that people don't know what they're doing, which is going to make any change very, very hard to implement moving forward. So sorry for that. I had to get that out there because I think this is like the critical topic in my view for, the next, for a long period of time, honestly.
Absolutely. There's so much to unpack there, but I think the 3-point story was a perfect way to explain it. And I will call this out. When I was early in my career and kind of learning about the world of work and trying to figure out where I was going, it's comforting to think somebody has this all figured out. Somebody up here, they've defined a best practice. All I have to do is execute on this best practice. Great. Okay, I can sleep at night. All I have to do is what this manual tells me to do. But the longer you're in your career and the more exposure you have to it, the more clear it is that, it's just like everybody talks about adulting, right? It's like at one point you look around and you realize, oh, I guess I'm the adult in the room and I'm supposed to make this decision. And I don't know what decision to make. What do you think, Bob? What do you think, Sheila? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, let's just go this way and see what happens, right? That is literally what happens a lot of times.
Well, but I think that this is sort of the thing. Like, it's okay to say you don't know, right? But I think that companies are so afraid to do that. And this is what's been interesting with the data-driven perspective, right? So we sort of look at how are people collaborating? How does that change over time? And even with that data, it's still a hypothesis, whatever your people decision is, right? You could say, well, I think based on how they work, this team should be in 3 days a week. I don't know if that's actually my hypothesis is that will work, that it is a hypothesis. And so by calling it that, you give yourself the permission to be wrong. And then if you're wrong, saying, hey, you know what? A couple weeks later, that didn't work. We're going to try something else. But I think the default approach that most companies take is to say, well, we know what the right decision is. And I think in the past, what that enabled people to do is fall into line and do this thing more easily. What I think you see happening now is people pushing back and saying, well, I just disagree with you. An easy example to think about, again, are these workplace strategy decisions. Companies saying we should come in 3 days a week because that makes us more productive. And then you have employees saying, I disagree. And there's nowhere to go from there if you don't have data, right? It's not, you can't say, if this team comes in 3 days a week, there's this specific behavior that we believe will be impacted by it. And so we're going to look at that metric and then we're going to report it back. Okay, it's not saying you're going to make everybody happy with that decision, but at least people can agree on a shared reality. The issue is that most companies for people decisions are essentially, when it boils down to it, most of those decisions are just this executive thinks this is the right decision because they feel like it's the right decision. That's it. And then your only way to convince people that's a good decision is to tell a better story than them. That's it. Right. And I think that that is a fundamentally limiting factor on how effective we can be as people managers within organizations.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And you know, this is being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, you know, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting insight. And I think, you know, going back to your NBA analogy, one of the terms you use, I think, is a really big assumption. And that's, you know, the assumption that people are rational. You know, there's a really big question mark there. And I think every HR person, every HR person listening to this right now is like, I know the answer to that.
Exactly.
But yeah. And I do think, you know, the power dynamic is shifting in the workplace as well. Like, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people didn't have things like the internet to go Google and have the collective knowledge of the universe available at their fingertips in order to find data or to find something that, that supported their hypothesis that, hey, no, 3 days a week isn't good for me. I want 0 days a week. And maybe I'll come in once a quarter for a, random meeting here and there if I absolutely have to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's the point. It's people aren't rational, which is we just have to deal with that. And that, I wouldn't pretend that having data, having analytics fundamentally changes that. But what it does enable people to, again, is to be able to level set because we don't have this objective perspective on work. And not to say that data is fully objective, like it's not, but that it is at least, a more uniform view on how work is happening. And I think enables us, again, to just ground our conversations in a shared understanding. And I think that is just so helpful for not just making better initial decisions, but moving much more quickly once it's clear that that decision isn't working. Because it takes companies so long now to change things about work that clearly are not effective, like clearly ineffective. But that, to your point, well, this is a best practice that we've just done for 30 years, or that company X does this and they're successful. But that neglects this idea that, you can take any large, successful, for example, tech company, right? All the big guys. If we're being honest, for the next couple of years, they could lock their employees in broom closets. And just by a notion of their overwhelmingly powerful market position, they would still be pretty successful, right? But that doesn't mean they were making the right people decisions during that time. And so just blindly copying them won't give you the sort of results you're looking for. But if instead we were able to say, well, here's quantitatively, what behaviors relate to performance in these organizations or in our organization, and this specific decision led to this change in behavior. Again, I think that's the way that I at least like to think about it, because then it's a lot clearer what the cause and effects are, and not 100% clear, but much more than just, company X implemented holacracy and they're really successful now, so it must have been because of that, versus could have been totally irrelevant. totally irrelevant, or it could have even detracted from their success, and it's just unclear.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I'm just thinking through, the workplace change initiatives and the challenges. A lot of times, HR people, a lot of times we're not in this because we're really good at data analytics. Right? We would probably be doing something different. We probably would have gone to school for something different. If we were really into, all that stuff. A lot of times we're more, empathetic, and we're about emotion and energy and culture and all these like cool buzzwords, and we're trying to help increase collaboration and all that stuff. But where we can get paralyzed is if we have an assumption and there's an emotion behind it. You can just get frozen because you're afraid of what the reaction might be from employees, or you're afraid that, this might degrade the culture. So if you don't have any sort of foundational data, even if it's not quantitative, even if it's quality, just general feedback, survey, whatever, like you still need to have some sort of a base case, like some sort of a thesis. And then you can make decisions objectively, right? Because if all us empaths are running around making all these decisions, we just won't go anywhere, and it'll be a drama every 5 minutes.
Just to be clear, right? It's not like, to your point, it's not to say that subjective feedback, surveys, just interviews, like that is still useful data. Like, just to be totally clear, right? It's a different kind of data, and I think you need that as well as behavioral data to have this holistic view, in my opinion. I think the other point, though, is that I don't want to say that everyone in HR should be data scientists and that's how the people side of business works. It's not, right? These are, I do think that these are new competencies that needed to be added to the mix. That doesn't mean that those data scientists should, maybe in some cases lead those teams. That doesn't mean like always, right? It means that I do think to be competitive long-term and to frankly just be successful even in the near term, like you need some folks like that on the team, right? Just to crunch over data that, again, you already have, just to be totally clear, right? Like everybody already has this kind of data. What we've tried to do at Humanyze, at least, is make it much easier to get started. But again, I don't want to pretend that like we do something that is impossible for other organizations to do. It's not, right? And that I do think that, the HR of the future, it's not just the way we've always done things, obviously, but it's also not just adding data scientists, to be clear. It's, and I do think I see a little bit more of this. It's having people with real estate background. It's having people with IT background, right? So you think about all of the things that, again, we talk about these fuzzy concepts like culture. Well, how would we define that? But of course, and so then data scientists can talk about it. Here's some actual metrics that we could calculate. But of course, it's not also just the HR processes we have. It's okay, well, what tools do we use to collaborate? And those tools, it could be, could be Zoom, it could be our physical offices. Can we make those decisions holistically rather than having those siloed in different parts of the organization? I would also think having people with advanced degrees in things like organizational behavior, IOPsych is very, very useful, not just to, again, I think, try to bring in some of the external research on the topic that is continually evolving, but also for planning experiments. Like, I think that is incredibly critical for HR being successful long-term is, again, the ability, first of all, to message this, which again, those people can't message, right? We come back to, folks in HR are much better at messaging those things. But that, all right, well, which parts of the organization, what data we should collect. Again, I think all these folks working together starts to get very, very exciting. And I think also become a much more central part of the organization. And I do feel like this is happening a little bit in different pockets of industry, but I think there's really the opportunity for this to happen, much more broadly, and for this to just be the way that HR functions for the long term.
Yeah, it's really interesting and encouraging for me. So, when I started in the field, it was totally by accident. I didn't go to school for HR, many HR people, they just kind of fall into it. Right. And so I was kind of coming from a different perspective, came from an operational background and kind of just stumbled my way into it and learned along the way. But it's really encouraging to see some of the new hires that I've brought into my team, out of college or recently out of college. And some of those topics and things that they're teaching at school in IOPsych and in, analysis and organizational design and comp design and that sort of thing. And it's, the other thing that I love is, and this is maybe generalizing a little bit, but they also are not afraid to challenge and say, hey, why don't we do this? We should do this, and a lot of times I'm like, well, I don't know what that is, but that sounds exciting. So yeah, let's discuss what is this thing? But it's really, what we've been talking about. It's like, it's just utilizing the scientific method
Yes.
to do something. That's it, and that's, and if you don't have some sort of a method like that, then you are just going to be throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And you could inappropriately assume that something that you did actually caused something, but it was just a corollary effect and it didn't have anything to do with it.
It's great you bring that up because I still teach the People Analytics Exec Ed course back at MIT. And one of the slides I have on there is actually the scientific method. It's like, let's just review. You probably remember this from like middle school science, but actually you could apply this in your job. And let's just review it. And it's not crazy complicated. It's a slightly different way to think about making, decisions about how we work. But I believe that pre-pandemic, because I've been teaching that course now for years, and pre-pandemic, it was maybe slightly a harder sell. Not that people didn't agree that, oh yeah, this is probably the right way to do things. But I think there was just so much inertia in the way that we've always done things, in that it's so hard to overcome that. And I think if there's a positive to come from the pandemic, it's that it's broken those things. It's said, everything is in flux, and that actually makes it easier to change. It also, I think, very nicely makes it harder to copy other people, which again, I think is this huge, really unproductive crutch that I would just say management has in general, because no one can credibly claim to know what they're doing today. I mean, if in the past you could say, oh, well, this is a successful company, they must know what they're doing. Well, no one's done this transition successfully. So no one can claim, oh, I actually know how to manage in a hybrid workplace. No, you don't. No one knows. So please, and that I think is very, very exciting, because there's going to be so many more models that people can try. And then again, this idea of, oh, how should we evaluate these different models? Oh, here's this thing we've used for hundreds of years in science that has been pretty damn successful. So let's probably go to that. It's been much easier to have those conversations.
Absolutely. And I think about it too, especially in when you're dealing with people, you are never going to have the answer.
Yes.
Ever. I mean, if you think that this is the best practice and Jack Welch did this, it worked, let's just use an example. We're going to force rank our employees because it worked, 40 years ago.
Yep.
And we'll put everybody and we'll make it transparent, and it'll just make sure that people are driven to excel, and the bottom 10% will either self-select or get removed from the organization. Perfect. It worked. It worked back then. It should work now. If you do something like that right now in this environment, good luck.
Right. Exactly.
because that, that what may have worked at that company could be a complete demoralizer in your organization. It could work. But if you think that we're just going to plow through this and, we'll know if it works in 5 years, when we look at our turnover levels, good luck to you.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. And I do think it's also, the other topic that I think is really fascinating. And I told you I was going to nerd out on this a little bit, but there's a reason that a theory is always a theory. Can you ever really prove anything 100%? The answer is no, not really, especially when you're dealing with people.
Yes. I do think this is actually an important distinction between industry and academia when it comes to experiments and analyses, because academia does default to this statistical significance, which why is that 0.05? Unclear. So that's also arbitrary. So whatever. But that the reason that's important is because when it comes down to it, we have to make decisions. And so we're never going to have complete information. And in some cases, so ideally, of course, we're able to run experiments and have statistical significance. But let's say you run an experiment. You could even do that internally, do everything right, and you don't have a significant result. That happens. You still ultimately have to make a decision, right? And so there are ways to evaluate, experiments, not just using statistical significance. But I do think that this is actually a real challenge that I've started to see. This actually, it's interesting because marketing has sort of gone through this transition. I do think that the marketing model is sort of the model that HR could follow, because marketing, right, 30 years ago, ask someone, what is a good click-through rate? People had no idea what that was. Right? And now it's an incredibly data-driven part of the organization, right? There are still creative folks there, but they're running tests, they're using data. And a lot of the things I think that HR is going to bump up against over the next, couple of decades, like that's what they dealt with, right? That sort of cultural transition. How do you build up these teams? How do you make this part of the, core competency of the field? Like, I really think that that's the model. But that one thing that you can see folks in marketing struggling with now, again, is when they bring in, a lot of these, pretty sophisticated data scientists, but they have this, rigorous academic background, which says that, here is statistical significance. If it's below that, you basically ignore it. But that doesn't apply as much in business. It still is important information, but that I do think this, again, that's why I really think that these multidisciplinary teams are going to be very, very effective, because you might have some academic, people with a stronger academic background who really hesitate to make a decision. But then again, someone with, more of that day-to-day business experience is going to be like, listen, I totally appreciate that, that objection, but like, I've got to choose A or B. Right. And so ultimately all I care about is, do we think A or B is likely to be better? And we might not have high confidence, and we can say that. Right. And that's actually useful, is saying that as well. Like, it's because then when you are really confident, right, not to say again, you're ever 100% confident, but then you can communicate that, like, we're going to do this and we're pretty confident it's going to work because of X, Y, and Z. Next time we're going to do B, but I don't have the same degree of confidence actually that I have. And again, it just allows for much more nuanced messaging to the organization, which I think is very, very helpful for the long-term success, not just for organizations, but people management in particular as well.
Absolutely. I had a great mentor early in my career. And she at one point we were struggling with the decision, and it was my decision to make. And I didn't have a breadth of experience to draw upon. I was relatively young, and she looked at me, she said, listen, it's worse to make no decision at all than to make the wrong decision. You just have to decide and move forward and adjust if it doesn't work. And
Yep.
She was 100% right.
Yep.
And now I think about it more in terms of like, it's just making a probabilistic bet.
Yes.
It's like, okay, what's the standard deviation that I am going to totally screw this up? and if I've got enough of a sample size, I can make that bet. And you know what, if I'm about 70%, I'm good, right? But if I'm about 40%, maybe I go back to the drawing board and I do a little more analysis. But I think that the more that we think in those terms, the better it is for the organization, because so often we get subjective because of a really small sample size. And the example that I'll use is like, that whatever decision you make, probably 10% of your workforce is going to get pissed off. That's just, I can get, I don't have data, right. but I bet you probably do, that there's like 10% of your workforce is going to hate whatever you do, because they just don't want to change. 10% of the workforce is probably going to be like, great, I love this, regardless of what you do, even if it's a terrible. And then you've kind of got the middle, right? but that's so often we focus on the 10% that are going to be negative about it at the detriment of everybody else. You've got to think bigger, right? That was a totally non-quantitative gut feel, empath describing that. So I'm sure.
No, but that's, again, I think that's, this is sort of the approach. And again, I think that, even for the data scientist folks, right? Like that approach, like statistically will serve us very well, I think is the important thing. And I think that this, again, thinking probabilistically is so important because we could have all the confidence in the world. Then when it comes down to that, ultimately, the outcomes of many, many things, particularly with regards to work, are probabilistic. And you can do all the right things. You could have all the right data. It could even show you all the right things. And that there's still a chance that things won't go like you wanted them to. And that's okay, right? I think embracing that is actually extremely helpful, not just when we're making decisions when it comes to, how we organize a company, these larger strategic decisions, but even when it comes to individual decisions, smaller things that we make all the time, that sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time. And that if you accept that might be why a particular program was successful, then you're going to constantly question, are we making the right calls? And not just think that, oh, well, listen, I've been really successful, so I must know what I'm doing, right? Like, no, you actually like probably do a little bit, like you probably did some hard work, but also you probably got lucky, like if we're being honest. And then if you have that perspective, then, right, you're never going to drink your own Kool-Aid too much. And you're always going to say like, all right, let me try to gut check this again. And it's, a lot of times you'll still go with what you thought, but that hopefully over time, you won't keep repeating things that actually are ineffective, and you never figure them out because you weren't interrogating them enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this has been just a fascinating conversation, but one of the areas that I maybe want to dig into a little bit is, I love the theory. I love the, kind of the approach. How does Humanyze think about taking all of this input and then giving it to a company that is actually actionable?
Yeah.
That actually gives them, some action items or some things to think about or work on. How do you take the big data and make it something you can do something with?
No, and this was really, obviously, again, coming out of our research, a lot of it was, well, what metrics actually matter for predicting outcomes? And that's sort of like the first step. The second step is, what are the metrics how can I give this data back to folks from where they are today so that they can understand what these metrics are and they can take action on them, to your point, right? And that has resulted, honestly, in us, like, we don't show all metrics that we can calculate or even that are predictive, because some of them they're still hard for folks to get their heads around. Like, as some of our customers get more sophisticated, we do show more and more. But, essentially what we did is, first we have dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed articles that we wrote about here's how behavior X relates to an outcome we care about. Again, retention, performance, decision-making speed, what have you. And so then what we did is we built this model. We called it organizational health score. And frankly, the important point about it from my end is not the score itself. It's there's actionable behavioral metrics that drive that. And that's actually what people you should pay attention to, right? But so what we do is we take all this data and we're able to combine it to understand how is work happening, how are people collaborating. And then we show you, all right, so you at a high level, for example, this part of the organization has a performance problem. Say, okay, like, what is that? And you dig into it. Oh, it turns out actually it's manager visibility. It's how much time managers are spending with teams. And it's specifically in this region, right? Like, that's where it's the biggest problem, right? And so essentially what we're able to do is automatically flag, like, here are things that, because we have such a massive data from across many companies, like, the ideal, to be clear, is you feed in KPIs from your business. And then so you can say a 10% change in this outcome leads to a Y, in this behavior leads to a Y% change in this outcome. Like, that's the ideal. But what we've tried to do is, even without that, because as probably a lot of us know, most organizations have pretty poor KPIs across the organization, right? Like, what's the performance of team X? Like, unless it's sales, honestly, like, you don't have great KPIs. And so what we're able to do, though, is be able to say, again, automatically, here's where you should focus your attention. And, probably a third of the time, there's some contextual explanation for why something really concerning is going on. And I'd say that's what out of the box our analytics are really good for, is saying what things are almost certainly bad, right? At a team level. And so you focus that in, because we could have data from 100,000 people, and I can tell you, here are the couple dozen teams where there are really big concerns, and here are the specific behaviors that are concerning. And so then that's your cue to dig in more, right? That's not to say, again, that our algorithms are like the be all end all. That's where, okay, we see that Team X, again, maybe managers aren't spending a lot of time with their teams. All right, well, it actually turns out that the product's on fire and we're having like lots of meetings trying to figure out strategically what to do. Great. Okay, like that's fine. Now you understand what's going on there. But of course it could also be like, here's an actual like, leadership problem. We need to run people through training. We need to, there's all these things you could think of. But the issue is that what we're really trying to do is expose these things are normally very opaque at macro scales. Like if you're on that team, you know what's going on. But if you're running HR for a large organization and trying to figure out, well, what actually are the most critical issues? The things that you normally rely on are, essentially self-report. It's, people say these things, but importantly, some of these things are stuff that is very, very challenging or almost impossible for individuals to be aware of. Like, so a good one is weak ties. It's an interesting example. So these are people, tell you how we define it, although the numbers are robust to definition. People you spend on average 5 to 15 minutes with in one-on-one communication, the equivalent of that a week, right? And a good way to think about these people, imagine someone who you're in a 4-person 1-hour meeting with once a week, right? So they're not on your team, but you like know each other and you like work a little bit on something together, but you're not working very closely with each other, right? So one thing we've seen with the rapid shift to remote work during the pandemic is those ties have fallen off a cliff. Like there is, 20+% decrease in the number of those ties, again, across the board. The thing is that people don't feel that at all. If you ask people in surveys, which we've done, like, how do you feel like your communication networks? Oh, I think it's the same. Because you think about like what percentage of your day are those weak ties? And it's very, very small, right? Because again, by definition, these are not like the people you work with on your team. And so that falling off by 20%, that's like changing how like 1% of your week, like 1 to 2% of your week is spent. You don't feel that. You don't feel that change. But that if you look at milestone attainment, large projects, if you look at innovation, those ties are disproportionately important for those outcomes. And so really what we're able to do is surface things that, yes, like some of these things on surveys, if you explicitly target it, you can figure them out. But there's a lot of these things that just individuals, we just don't, because we don't have that macro perspective, but that this kind of data can make that clear. And so what we've tried to do is use terminology that people understand. Again, have lots of actual, citations that people, understand. We say this is important. Here's, all these different, cases and actually academic articles about why it's important. The ideal, of course, is to get KPIs. But that, again, even in the absence of that, we're able to do some pretty powerful things.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And that weak ties example, I just think about, that you've just quantified what we've all been trying to describe as to why the workplace is important, why the physical workplace was important, or the accidental, interruptions and, water cooler talk and stuff. It's that, that weak ties. That was kind of a light bulb moment for me to think through that. And, and when you don't get that, in your workplace, it makes a lot of things more challenging. So, yep. Interesting. All right. Well, this is just a fascinating conversation. So, I'd encourage anybody who wants to learn more, go check out Humanyze. It's human, YZE, get connected and learn. I'm definitely gonna take it from here. But I do want to shift gears and go into the Rebel HR Flash Round. I'm fascinated to hear these responses. So, all right, 3 quick questions. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. Question number 1: what is your favorite people book?
I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with this one. My favorite people book, I'd argue it's a people book. It's called A Small World by Duncan Watts. And it's actually now, the book's almost 20 years old, but it's a really fascinating look at networks and the different aspects of them and how small changes at the individual level have these really systemic impacts on the network as a whole. And a lot of it is focused on people, but there are things like analysis of internet networks and other kinds of networks as well. But I think the focus is on people. So I will call it a people book. But this is one of the few books. I mean, obviously I read it a while ago, but it really dramatically changed my perspective on sort of what actually matters when it comes to systems. And I think, again, especially for organizations, I think it's a very easy, I think it's a very, general consumption book, but it, I think, gives some very well-researched perspectives on people. So I highly recommend that.
Very cool. Very cool. Question number 2, who should we be listening to?
There's a couple people. I've actually, over the past, let's say like 6 months, gotten more and more interested in the whole area of AI ethics. Obviously, because it's related to our work at Humanyze, but also just think it's this really emerging area that I think is incredibly important for all organizations that deal with data in any capacity, right? And I'd argue that people data is some of the most sensitive data out there. A lot of the folks in this space, and there's 2 people I want to call out in particular, Kathleen Creel, who's over at Stanford, and also Ifeoma Ajunwa, who's at UNC, looking at sort of 2 different aspects of AI ethics, but they are focused on people data within organizations. There's folks like Joy Buolamwini, who's out of MIT, who's done a lot with just general societal data, looking at like things like facial recognition, and that is very important, but it is not as relevant as some of the work that Kathleen and Ifeoma have been doing, where Kathleen has really looked at a framework around how organizations use algorithms to make people decisions, and looking a lot at algorithmic hiring in particular, which obviously is a very hot topic right now. But I think her research, it's this very rigorous framework for how organizations should think about, like, how should we apply ethically these kind of technologies? What should we be looking at in terms of evaluating not just their efficacy, but also their pitfalls, and how should we constantly question these things?
Yeah.
And it's just really fascinating work there. Whereas Ifeoma Ajunwa over at UNC has been doing fascinating work on people data within organizations, and what are some of, and again, obviously this is very directly relevant to Humanyze, but she's focused on a lot of things like Fitbit data, like when companies give out Fitbits for wellness programs, like what happens with that data. And it's sort of concerning, but fascinating as well. And I think the implications for folks, frankly, like Humanyze, but also other companies doing this sort of thing, is not just what are your intentions, but really trying to think through what are the implications of how you're collecting this kind of data. And so I would, again, highly recommend, there's more talks than ever before from academic departments available for consumption. So, I'd highly recommend checking out some of these folks. Again, Stanford High has a lot of these talks. So does, again, Ifeoma's program over at UNC. I think it's like called AI and Decision Sciences, I think, are 2 off the top of my head. But I tweet about lots of those talks. So if people like talks, but that's what I gravitate towards, honestly, is those sort of folks.
Fascinating. And I do think, whether you like it or not, it's going to be a part of HR's job, and it already is in many respects. So yeah, we've got to be mindful of that entering the workplace. Last question. How can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so as you pointed out, there's the Humanyze website where you can reach out there. I'm also on Twitter. So it's just at @bwaber, and feel free to reach out to me there, and I will probably respond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably worth a follow, and I'm definitely going to be following along. Really appreciate the work, the approach, and I think that my challenge to everybody that's listening right now is, if you're not thinking in these concepts or thinking about how these sorts of things can help you make decisions in your organization, you owe it to your teams to start to get educated and learn. So, Ben, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today, and thank you for the work.
Thanks so much.
Take care. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.